Imagine a courtroom so silent you could hear a pin drop. A man stands there, frail, worn, and homeless. No one expects him to matter. But when the judge reads his name, Elijah Thompson, everything changes. The room freezes. Whispers die. And slowly, the entire courtroom rises. Why? Because this old man isn't just anyone. He's a master sergeant, a decorated war hero whose bravery once saved countless lives overseas. And yet, he came home to be forgotten. Homeless. Ignored. Today, his story is finally being told. A story of sacrifice, courage, and honor. A story that proves heroism isn't measured by recognition, but by the lives we touch, the choices we make, and the courage we carry when no one is watching. Watch till the end, because Elijah Thompson's journey will leave you speechless. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. Papers rustled. A clock ticked loudly on the far wall, each second echoing through the room like a reminder that no one wanted to be here longer than necessary. At the center of it all stood a man no one bothered to look at. He was old, thin. His coat was frayed at the cuffs, stained by years of weather and neglect. The boots on his feet were cracked, the soles worn down to nearly nothing. His hands, dark, trembling slightly, were clasped together in front of him, restrained by steel cuffs that looked far too heavy for wrists that thin. To most people in the room, he was just another case. Another file. Another number. Another name they would forget by lunchtime. Two young officers stood behind him. Tall, clean uniforms. Faces blank with professionalism. They had escorted dozens of defendants into this same spot before. To them, this man was no different. Homeless. Disorderly conduct. Trespassing. That's what the paperwork said. The prosecutor barely glanced at him. She shuffled her notes, already confident this would be quick. The public defender assigned to the case sighed quietly, knowing resources were thin and expectations lower. No family sat behind the man. No friends. No one who seemed to care how this ended. The judge entered, and the room rose out of habit rather than respect. Robes rustled as he took his seat, adjusting his glasses while scanning the docket. Next case, the judge said calmly. The clerk stood. Case number 417. The state versus. She paused. Not for long, just a fraction of a second. But enough. She cleared her throat and continued. Mr. Elijah Thompson. The name floated into the air and landed softly. Nothing happened. No gasps. No whispers. No dramatic reaction. Just silence. Elijah Thompson remained still. His eyes stayed forward. Not defiant. Not scared. Just distant. As if he had learned long ago that reacting only brought trouble. The judge looked down at the man for the first time. Really looked. Noticed the posture, straight despite the years. The way Elijah stood at attention without realizing it. The faint outline of something beneath the coat. Medals, maybe. Or memories. How do you plead? The judge asked. Elijah's voice was low. Rough. Like it hadn't been used much lately. Not guilty, Your Honor. Somewhere in the back, a quiet scoff. A woman shook her head. Another defendant, waiting for his own hearing, whispered something sarcastic to a friend. The judge nodded, flipping through the file. Mr. Thompson, he said, you are accused of trespassing on federal property and refusing to vacate when ordered. Do you understand the charges? Yes, sir. The judge hesitated again. Something about the way the man spoke. Respectful. Old-fashioned. Why were you there? The judge asked. Elijah took a breath. I was cold, he said simply. No excuses. No anger. No self-pity. Just truth. The courtroom seemed to lean in slightly, though no one would admit it. You were found sleeping near a restricted monument, the prosecutor said, standing. This area is clearly marked. He was warned and refused to leave. Elijah lowered his gaze. I didn't refuse, he said softly. I just couldn't walk anymore. One of the officers shifted his weight. The judge looked uncomfortable. And your address? The clerk asked. Elijah didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, I don't have one. That earned a few murmurs. The judge sighed. Mr. Thompson, do you have any prior military service? Elijah's head lifted. Just a little. Yes, sir. The judge raised an eyebrow. Branch. Elijah swallowed. Army. The courtroom grew quieter. The judge leaned back. Years of service? 22. That got attention. A quiet laugh from someone quickly died when no one else joined. Rank, the judge asked. Elijah hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it felt heavy. Master Sergeant, he said. Silence. The judge froze. The prosecutor slowly lowered her pen. One of the officers blinked, looking at Elijah again, really looking now. The judge leaned forward, voice suddenly careful. Master Sergeant Thompson, were you stationed overseas? Yes, sir. Where? Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment. Korea. Vietnam. Places that don't exist the same way anymore. The room felt different now. Not loud, not dramatic, but charged. The judge stared at the name on the file again. Elijah Thompson. And for the first time since court had begun, the judge's voice wasn't routine. It was uncertain. Mr. Thompson, he said quietly, please remain standing. Elijah did, unmoving, uncomplaining. And somewhere deep in the judge's memory, a name began to echo from an old report, an old commendation, a story he hadn't thought about in decades. A story that was never supposed to end like this. The courtroom air had shifted. The name alone, Master Sergeant Thompson, had done something subtle yet undeniable. Eyes that had once skimmed over him now lingered. Whispered conversation stopped. Phones were lowered. Even the murmurs of curiosity were replaced by a quiet tension, like the room itself was holding its breath. The judge leaned back in his chair, staring at the man whose hands were cuffed in front of him. Those hands, thin, worn, and trembling slightly, had once held weapons of war, had carried wounded comrades, had written reports that changed the course of missions. But now, they were restrained by cold steel, a symbol of the world's failure to notice the man behind the uniform. Master Sergeant Thompson, the judge said, voice steady but tinged with curiosity, your record indicates distinguished service. You were awarded multiple honors during your time in the military. Elijah nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the floor. Yes, sir. I received a few. Not many remember them. The judge adjusted his glasses, suddenly paging through the file more carefully. He noticed something he had overlooked: citations, commendations, medals, some faded, some worn, but all remarkable. One in particular caught his eye: the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military award for valor. It was accompanied by a note: for extraordinary heroism during combat operations overseas. The courtroom, which had been filled with the ordinary hum of a routine trial, now felt charged. People in the audience whispered among themselves. A young officer shifted uncomfortably, realizing for the first time that the man they had simply labeled as homeless and troubled was someone of extraordinary history, someone who had faced danger that most could never imagine. Elijah spoke again, quietly, almost as if speaking aloud these truths was a burden he had carried alone for decades. I lost many friends, saw many die, did what I had to do, and when it was over, I came home, and the world didn't see me anymore. The words hung in the air like smoke. No one knew how to respond. The prosecutor, who had come expecting an easy conviction, swallowed hard. Her notes felt suddenly trivial in the face of decades of courage and sacrifice. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, is it true that you were considered a hero by your unit? That your actions saved countless lives during the Vietnam War? Elijah nodded again. Yes, sir, but I don't tell stories. I've never told them. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant, as if he feared recognition might somehow undo the reality he lived with every day. I did what I had to do, and then I returned to a country that forgot me. At this, the courtroom gasped collectively. People looked around at one another, realizing they were witnessing something far beyond a simple trial. The man before them, thin, fragile, and cuffed, had been a soldier whose bravery had changed the lives of hundreds. Yet here he stood, accused of something as ordinary as trespassing. The judge, whose face had been unreadable moments before, softened. He leaned back and spoke slowly. Mr. Thompson, I am troubled by this. How does someone who served with such honor end up here? In these circumstances, facing such a minor charge. Elijah's eyes flickered briefly to the judge, filled with a mix of sorrow and resignation. Life, after service, it's not easy for some of us, sir. I did my part for my country, and when I returned, I had nothing left. No home, no family, no one who understood the cost. A murmur rippled through the audience. People shifted, suddenly seeing the man not as a defendant, but as a human being, a hero who had been abandoned. The prosecutor, caught between procedure and humanity, finally spoke. Your Honor, I wasn't aware of the full extent of Mr. Thompson's service. This is extraordinary. Yes, the judge said. His voice was calm but firm. It is, and it changes everything. He looked at the officers holding Elijah's arms, then back to the courtroom. Sometimes we forget that heroes are not always celebrated. Sometimes they're ignored, forgotten, left to struggle in silence. Elijah's face remained composed, but his eyes glimmered with a hint of tears. He had never expected acknowledgement, let alone in the center of a courtroom filled with strangers. Yet here it was, recognition, delayed but undeniable. The courtroom began to buzz softly. Some stood, some whispered. The atmosphere shifted from judgment to reverence. People who had come expecting to witness a simple legal proceeding were now witnesses to a moment of reckoning. A truth long buried was finally rising to the surface. The judge turned his attention fully to Elijah. Master Sergeant, it is clear to this court that you are not the person who should be punished today. Your service, your sacrifice, and the life you've led deserve respect, not condemnation. Elijah lowered his head slightly, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. It was not victory. It was not closure. But it was acknowledgement, something he had been denied for decades. The clerk rose, and the judge addressed the court. Let the record reflect that Master Sergeant Elijah Thompson is hereby cleared of this minor charge. The court recognizes his distinguished service and the sacrifices he has made. And then, as if on cue, something remarkable happened. The entire courtroom rose. Officers, lawyers, spectators, every single person in the room stood. The action was unspoken but unanimous. Respect, honor, recognition. These are the silent languages spoken that day. And for the first time in decades, Elijah Thompson stood not as a forgotten man, not as a defendant, not as a number in a system, but as a hero. He looked around. Faces softened. Eyes held admiration, awe, and a hint of guilt. Guilt for having overlooked what had been right in front of them. And though he had endured years of hardship and neglect, this simple act, standing acknowledgement, brought a small, quiet peace to his soul. Elijah's voice was steady when he finally spoke. Thank you. That means more than you can imagine. The judge nodded solemnly. Your story is a reminder to us all. Heroism is not always recognized in time, but courage, sacrifice, and honor, they cannot be erased. The officers released their hold, and Elijah's hands, once bound, were now free. The medals he had worn for decades seemed to shine anew under the courtroom lights, not just on his chest, but in the recognition of every person present. As the courtroom emptied, whispers of respect and admiration followed him. People spoke quietly to one another, recounting the bravery they had just witnessed. A veteran, forgotten by society, had finally been seen, and in that acknowledgement, a small piece of justice was served. Outside the courtroom, the world continued. But for Elijah Thompson, the day was not about the world outside. It was about being seen, about being recognized, about finally, in some small way, being honored for the life he had led, the sacrifices he had made, and the courage he had carried silently all those years. And though his path ahead would still be difficult, for life rarely rewards the forgotten overnight, something intangible had shifted. The world had seen him. For a moment, the weight he had carried alone for decades felt lighter, and that, in itself, was a victory greater than any medal could convey. The courtroom had emptied, leaving Elijah Thompson standing alone for a moment. But in his mind, the present was no longer the only reality. It was as if the weight of decades peeled away, and he was transported back to another place, another time, a battlefield that never truly left him. He saw it clearly, the dense jungles of Vietnam. Sweat and mud caked his uniform. Bullets zipped past like angry hornets, and the cries of his comrades filled the humid air. A young lieutenant shouted orders, but everything seemed chaotic. Smoke clung to his lungs. Fear wrapped itself around every soldier in his unit. And yet, in that chaos, Elijah moved with purpose. Every step was calculated, every decision critical. A patrol unit had been ambushed. Men were pinned down, some screaming for help, some silent and bleeding. Explosions shook the ground beneath him. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and rain mixed into a pungent haze. "Cover me," he yelled, sprinting into the open, dodging fire. His hands gripped his rifle with precision, yet his mind was already calculating. Who was wounded? Where were the mines? How many were still alive? He spotted a young private, terrified, clutching a bleeding leg. Without hesitation, Elijah dove into the mud, pulling the soldier out of the line of fire. Another explosion sent dirt and debris flying. He shielded the boy with his own body, the metal of his helmet ringing with impact, but he didn't falter. Somewhere, a grenade bounced dangerously close. Time slowed. Elijah lunged, rolling over the device, shielding his comrades. The explosion was deafening. When the smoke cleared, he counted the men still standing. Miraculously, none had died in that moment, though the cost would be paid in scars, both visible and invisible. Every action he took was a choice between life and death, his own and those of others. And yet, in the eyes of the world back home, he would later be reduced to a file number, a story untold, forgotten. The memory shifted. He was now on a transport plane, wounded soldiers lying in stretcher rows. One young man, no older than 18, clutched his chest. Elijah knelt beside him, applying pressure to a wound, whispering encouragement. "Stay with me, son. You're going to be okay." The boy's eyes met his for a fleeting moment, filled with trust and fear, and then the plane shuddered from turbulence. Elijah's hands were steady, but his heart raced. Every life he saved felt like a victory. It was always tempered by loss. Friends who had laughed and trained with him were gone, swallowed by war, by missions, by mistakes. And yet, through it all, Elijah held on. He held on to honor, to duty, to the unspoken code that had defined his life. Because even in a world where recognition was scarce, where medals were just pieces of metal, where the country moved on as if he never existed, he knew he had done what was right. Back in the courtroom, reality intruded. Elijah's hands, still trembling slightly, gripped the edge of the wooden bench. He blinked rapidly, trying to reconcile the past with the present. The judge's words still echoed in his ears. Heroism is not always recognized in time, but courage, sacrifice, and honor, they cannot be erased. And they hadn't been erased. Not entirely. The flashbacks continued, vivid and relentless. He remembered a night operation in the mountains. Rain poured, turning the earth into slick mud. Visibility was almost zero. His unit had been surrounded, pinned down by enemy forces. Morale was low, exhaustion high. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Panic would have been easy. It would have been justified. But Elijah didn't panic. He had trained for moments like this, moments that demanded clarity under chaos. He crawled through the mud, leading a small team to flank the enemy. He gave precise instructions, communicated silently, saved lives by anticipating the enemy's moves. By dawn, his squad was alive. The ambushers had been pushed back, yet when the report reached headquarters, he was barely mentioned. Just another soldier in the casualty report. He had learned long ago that heroism was not about recognition. It was about action, and action alone. And he had acted every single day. The courtroom faded again in his mind, replaced by a memory of a young woman, a nurse stationed at a field hospital. Her hand shook as she treated a severely wounded comrade. She looked up at him, eyes wide, voice trembling. "I don't know if he'll make it." Elijah gripped her shoulder. "He will. You do your part. I'll do mine. And he did. Every life mattered. Every moment counted. Every decision was a heartbeat away from tragedy. And still, he returned home, silently carrying the weight of every life he had saved and every life he couldn't. Now, standing in the courtroom, he realized the irony. Decades had passed, yet here he was, still fighting a battle, not in the jungles of Vietnam, but against a world that had forgotten him. For years, he had slept on streets, in shelters, wherever he could, always alone, always unacknowledged. And yet, today had changed everything. Recognition, delayed, imperfect, but real, had arrived. The judge had acknowledged him. The courtroom had risen. People had finally seen what he had done, even if the world outside remained unaware. For the first time in years, Elijah allowed himself a small, quiet smile. It wasn't about medals. It wasn't about fame. It was about being seen, truly seen. And in that moment, decades of pain and invisibility began to lift, if only slightly. The flashback slowed. The past remained vivid, but they no longer felt like chains. They were proof of bravery, proof of sacrifice, proof of a life lived with courage and integrity. Elijah Thompson, homeless, aging, scarred, and yet unbroken, finally understood. Heroism doesn't demand an audience. But when recognition does come, even after decades, it carries the power to heal wounds that time alone cannot touch. And in that understanding, in that quiet acknowledgement of a life well lived, he found a peace that had eluded him for far too long. The courtroom was quiet after the judge's declaration. Elijah Thompson stood with his hands free, medals glinting under the soft overhead lights. People were slowly returning to their seats, still processing what had just happened. The air was thick with realization, respect, and a lingering sense of guilt. They had all overlooked him for years, a man who had fought and bled for the very freedoms they often took for granted. For a moment, Elijah didn't move. He allowed himself to take in the scene. The judge, solemn yet respectful. The officers, nodding subtly in admiration. And the audience, whispering among themselves, glancing at him with newfound recognition. It was overwhelming, yet strangely quiet. The weight of years lifted slightly, replaced by something he had almost forgotten, acknowledgement. A young journalist in the back cleared her throat, standing to address the room. Master Sergeant Thompson, she began, voice trembling slightly, would you share a few words about your service in this moment today? Elijah looked around, unsure at first. Speaking had never been his forte, but something inside him shifted. He straightened his back, letting the decades of silence and humility converge into a single, steady voice. I never served for recognition, he said, voice calm but firm. I served because it was right, because the men beside me depended on me, and I depended on them. And for years, I lived with the consequences of choices made in war, unseen and unknown. Today, I'm simply grateful to be seen, finally. A silence fell over the room again. It was heavier than the previous one, not tense but reverent. Every person felt the weight of his words. For the first time, they weren't just hearing a story, they were feeling it. The judge, moved visibly, stood and addressed the court. This is a reminder to all of us. True heroism is often invisible, but it shapes the world quietly, profoundly, and without fanfare. Let this court remember that recognition may come late, but it must come. Elijah nodded slightly. There were no tears yet, only a quiet strength, a steady presence that radiated dignity despite years of hardship. And for those watching, that quiet strength spoke louder than any dramatic gestures could. Outside the courtroom, the world had begun to notice. Social media, always hungry for viral moments, had captured snippets of the trial. Videos of the courtroom rising for Elijah were spreading rapidly, with comments pouring in from across the nation. A true hero finally recognized. Why did it take so long? We owe him everything. Local news channels picked up the story. Veteran organizations reached out. A small group of volunteers offered assistance, ensuring that Elijah had a safe place to stay, proper meals, and support for the challenges that had shadowed him since his return from service. For Elijah, these gestures were unfamiliar, almost surreal. He had spent years alone, unnoticed, learning to survive on his own. Now, strangers were extending hands of care, respect, and admiration. He had never sought this attention, but he received it with quiet humility, grateful for what it represented, a bridge between the world he had left and the world he now inhabited. In the weeks following the trial, Elijah's life began to change incrementally. Not suddenly, not extravagantly, but with a steady rhythm that matched the life he had always lived, disciplined, deliberate, and grounded in values he had never compromised. Local veterans organizations invited him to speak at memorial events, to share his experiences with younger service members, to offer lessons not just in strategy, but in courage, honor, and sacrifice. And each time he spoke, his story resonated, leaving an impression that words alone could scarcely capture. Despite the recognition, Elijah remained humble. He never asked for attention. He never sought praise. Yet every acknowledgement, every handshake, every quiet word of gratitude reminded him that the world could see him now, finally, and that in itself was transformative. Elijah also began reconnecting with the broader community. Volunteers helped him secure housing, medical care, and even a small scholarship for a program helping veterans reintegrate into society. Neighbors, once unaware of the man who had lived on the streets, began greeting him with respect and curiosity. Slowly, he discovered that being acknowledged did not make him weak. It made him human. And yet, even with these changes, Elijah carried the memories of war like a silent companion. Flashbacks would still emerge. The jungle ambushes, the cries of wounded soldiers, the moments when lives hung by the thinnest threads. But now he could share those stories with people who listened, who understood, who appreciated the gravity of what he had endured. And in sharing, he found a healing that had eluded him for decades. Months passed, and Elijah became more than a story of a forgotten veteran recognized too late. He became a symbol, a reminder to the world of the sacrifices made quietly, without expectation of reward. Schools invited him to speak about courage, responsibility, and service. Local newspapers ran features on his life, not just as a war hero, but as a man who had faced neglect and homelessness with unwavering dignity. Yet through it all, he remained grounded. He did not seek fame. He did not crave attention. He wanted only to live with purpose, to help where he could, and to ensure that no other veteran would have to endure what he had. The trial that had begun as a moment of potential humiliation had transformed into a life-changing recognition. It was a testament to the idea that even when the world forgets, the truth cannot be buried forever. Courage, sacrifice, and honor endure, even in silence, even in obscurity. As Elijah walked through the park one quiet morning, medals glinting in the sunlight, a young boy approached him. "Sir, are you really a hero?" Elijah looked down at the boy, smiling faintly. "Heroism isn't about what people call you. It's about what you do when no one is watching. Always remember that." The boy nodded solemnly, eyes wide with understanding. And in that moment, Elijah realized something profound. His story would continue, not just in newspapers or courtrooms, but in the lessons he passed to others, in the hope he inspired, in the lives he touched quietly, without expectation. He had been seen. He had been recognized. But now, more importantly, he could continue to serve, not on distant battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of those who would carry his lessons forward. And for Elijah Thompson, that was a victory greater than any medal, any recognition, or any public acknowledgement. It was the legacy of a life lived with unwavering courage, honor, and resilience. A legacy that could never be erased. Elijah Thompson sat quietly on a wooden bench overlooking a small park near his new apartment. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting patterns of gold and green across the pathway. For the first time in decades, he felt a sense of peace, not fleeting, not fragile, but real, as though the world had finally acknowledged his presence and his sacrifices. The medals pinned to his chest were no longer just pieces of metal. They were symbols of a life of courage, endurance, and commitment to something greater than himself. And yet, as he looked at them, he understood that recognition alone could never fully capture the weight of his experiences. Years of war, loss, and struggle had left invisible scars, but now those scars were a part of him. Proof of resilience, proof that he had survived, and proof that he had acted with honor when others could not. Elijah thought back to the courtroom, that moment when the judge read his name aloud, that hush that fell over the room, the collective realization of the people present, that he was not just a homeless veteran, not just a defendant, but a man who had saved lives, led soldiers, and endured unimaginable hardship. That moment had changed everything. The courtroom, the people in it, even Elijah himself, they had all witnessed a truth that could no longer be ignored. And for him, it was not about vengeance or revenge. It was about acknowledgement, dignity, and the simple human need to be seen. In the following weeks, Elijah's life began to transform in subtle but profound ways. Volunteer groups and veteran organizations helped him secure a comfortable apartment, providing stability he had not known for years. He received invitations to speak at local schools, veteran events, and community centers, not to glorify war, but to share lessons of courage, leadership, and humanity. He taught that heroism is not defined by medals alone. It is measured by the willingness to act when others hesitate, by the choice to protect life at great personal risk, and by the integrity to uphold one's values, even when recognition is absent. Through his talks, Elijah found a renewed purpose. Young people, veterans, and ordinary citizens alike were moved by his story. They saw not only the hardships of war, but also the ongoing struggles of those who returned home, the invisible battles that continued long after the fighting had ended. Despite the recognition and support, Elijah remained humble. He never sought attention. Fame was never his goal. His joy came from witnessing others grow, learn, and act with courage. Every handshake, every nod of respect, every tear shed by someone hearing his story reinforced the belief that his life had mattered. And yet, he carried memories that were not so easily shared. The faces of fallen comrades, the cries of the wounded, the night skies lit by gunfire, the choices made in split seconds that determined who would live and who would die. Those memories were heavy, but now he could speak of them without shame. He could honor those who had not survived. Elijah often visited memorials, placing flowers quietly, bowing his head in respect. People would approach, asking questions, listening to stories of heroism that had long been hidden. Some wept, some thanked him profusely, and in every interaction, Elijah recognized that his legacy was no longer defined by neglect or anonymity. It was defined by the lives he had touched, not just during war, but after it, through example and mentorship. Every person inspired by his story became part of a ripple effect, carrying lessons of courage and honor into the world. One afternoon, a young boy approached him in a park, eyes wide with curiosity. "Sir," he said, "why didn't anyone know about you before?" Elijah smiled gently, resting a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "Sometimes the world forgets, but what matters is not whether people see you at first, but whether you keep living with courage anyway. True heroism doesn't need an audience." The boy nodded slowly, as though absorbing a profound lesson. Elijah realized in that moment that his story, once hidden, now shared, was more than personal recognition. It was teaching the next generation the values that cannot be measured by medals or rank: integrity, sacrifice, and resilience. Even as he embraced this new chapter of life, Elijah knew that many veterans still suffered in silence. Homelessness, mental trauma, and neglect were realities for far too many. His story, while powerful, was a symbol, a reminder that society must care for those who had given everything. He began collaborating with veteran charities, helping to fund programs for housing, healthcare, and mental wellness. He understood that true service does not end when the battlefield is left behind. It continues in helping others navigate the challenges that follow. Through these efforts, Elijah found a profound sense of fulfillment. Every veteran helped, every life improved, every story heard became a continuation of the legacy he had built decades ago. It was proof that recognition, once given, could lead to action and change. Years later, Elijah sat quietly in his apartment, a small stack of letters from people whose lives he had touched beside him. Children, veterans, ordinary citizens, all expressing gratitude for his lessons and guidance. He read each one carefully, smiling softly. Each letter was a reminder that even though the world had once overlooked him, his impact was real, lasting, and far-reaching. Elijah reflected on his journey. The battles fought overseas, the streets he had walked alone, the courtroom where justice had been intertwined with acknowledgement, and the lives he was now helping to change. It was a life that had known darkness and light, despair and triumph, silence and recognition. And in that reflection, he realized something profound. Heroism does not fade. It persists quietly through action, integrity, and courage. Recognition may come late, but the value of a life lived honorably endures forever. As the sun set, casting golden light through his window, Elijah stood and looked out over the city. He was no longer just a forgotten veteran. He was a symbol of resilience, a teacher of courage, a living testament to the power of honor. In the quiet of that moment, he whispered to himself, almost as a promise, "I live with courage. I endured with honor. And now I will continue to serve, not on battlefields, but in hearts and minds, wherever my story can inspire." For Elijah Thompson, the journey that began in silence, struggle, and neglect had reached a new dawn, one of recognition, purpose, and lasting legacy. And in that legacy, he found a peace that no war, no hardship, and no neglect could ever take away.